This is NatSec Matters.
I'm your host, Jeremy Bash with Beacon Global Strategies. Before we begin our discussion today, we wanted to take a moment to share that NatSec Matters, our podcast, recently surpassed 1 million downloads. This milestone would not have been possible without our incredible listeners. Thank you for tuning into the show in 2025, and we look forward to another terrific year of national security discussions in 2026. Today on our podcast, I am joined by David Shedd, former acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, former chief of station for the CIA in a Western Hemisphere capital, former leader of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and former special assistant to President George W. Bush for intelligence programs at the National Security Council. David is the senior advisor to Beacon Global Strategies and a longtime friend, and he joins us today to discuss the recent U.S. military strikes in Venezuela, as well as the capture and indictment of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. Together, we will examine that operation and its implications for regional security and U.S. strategic interests. Stay with us as we speak with David Shedd. David, welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy. Delighted to be here and to join your audience.
Well, let's first start with this extraordinary and consequential operation that unfolded on the morning of January 3rd, 2026, when U.S. Army Special Operations Forces from the 1st Special Operational Forces Detachment Delta, also known as Delta Force, flew into Caracas, Venezuela, with the Night Stalkers from the 160th Special Operations Air Regiment out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to conduct an extraordinary rendition of the leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, so that they could stand federal charges for drug trafficking, narco trafficking. David, first, in terms of the operation itself, an unprecedented military effort to take out the leader of another country. What do you make of the military's actions here and the president's decision to conduct this strike?
What appears to me, and keeping it all at the unclassified level, is that this was an enormous operation that was weeks in the planning, and we saw the preparation really underway in terms of the pre-staging since about August, early September, in terms of the deployment of the U.S. fleet ships, and then when the Gerald Ford came in terms of the mega message of force, is that the preparation was underway for a pathway forward that would ultimately result in the Nicolas Maduro and maybe even beyond that in terms of the regime members being brought to justice, of which a good number of them, including Maduro, of course, been under indictment for a number of years. The planning for something like this cannot be overstated in terms of the complexities, the security required, and I think as importantly for your audience to understand the codependencies of intelligence, whether it was human sources on the ground, the signals intelligence, the cyber capabilities, and the ability then to operationalize that, as we saw in 2011 against Osama bin Laden at Abbottabad and the compound there, that it required an enormous amount of effort in advance of doing this. The other message that I want to leave with the audience is it could have gone terribly badly, and it did not. In other words, all that planning paid off from all evidence that we see 72 hours later or so in a manner that really is breathtaking in terms of that operation. To think of going into a capital of a country like Caracas in Venezuela and be able to arrest as a law enforcement operation. So this really required the FBI, the DEA, the CIA, and those elements, along with the National Geospatial Agency and all of those, to collaborate and undertake this operation with meticulous planning on the part of the Department of War, Department of Defense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The incredible professionalism of our military and intelligence teams were on full display. Of course, one thing that struck me, and I wanted just to ask you about, it seemed like Maduro was completely caught by surprise. His own security forces mounted little to no opposition. I mean, is it that we're that good, or that they are that not that good? I mean, what do you make of the fact that we just flew into a country and grabbed the leader and brought him back to Lower Manhattan?
Well, it starts with the air defense suppression that undoubtedly took place, and we saw the flash and bangs around the city, and there was also deception operations in terms of mounting some of that in the countryside in other cities, so that there was a distraction as well. The element of surprise cannot be overstated as well. Now, the protective detail and all of that he had, I don't think we have the details of who might have been taken out. But what is really evident is that the Venezuelan army certainly did not put up the kind of resistance. Again, I think because of the element of surprise, and we even see that in the recounting of Maduro and his wife trying to get into their safe space with the steel door and all of that, as it's been recounted, that it totally took him by surprise. And the fact is that after he had been in his, what now is widespread, the video of him in the car making the offer on oil, that he probably thought that was still something that might be under consideration. And yet now we know that it was weather that might have delayed actually this operation by a few days in any case. And so I think it's really a combination of surprise, capabilities by the U.S., the absence of capabilities by the Venezuelans to respond, and then we don't know the story of the inner circle of his protective detail and what has happened to them. The rumors are that a number of his Cuban protector guards and all of that were killed in the operation, but that speaks to the again the professionalism of our forces of Delta coming in and doing what they did.
Let's now turn to the rationale for the operation. Of course, the foundational rationale is this indictment on drug trafficking. But when President Trump spoke about this, he spoke a lot about oil and a lot about the energy reserves within Venezuela. Of course, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others have talked about the importance of democracy and ending the autocratic rule of Maduro. And there are other interests of the United States in Venezuela. So let's just unpack some of those. What do you think was the main reason for this operation from the perspective of the Trump administration?
I believe that when all's said and done, and I think we need some more time to see this unfold, it was ultimately about regime change. And I'm not going to say that there is a fiction behind the drug trafficking buildup in terms of the counterattacks to the trafficking on the high seas. Over 35 vessels allegedly have been that were involved in narco trafficking. That's the allegedly part. The allegedly part is not that they were taken out. They were taken out. We're all part of the of this, and so I think clear-eyed view today, I would say it was a manifestation of a regime change under the parameters of a law enforcement operation that has rendered Maduro and his wife to the Southern District of New York, as you noted in your opener. Now, when I try to unpack it further, yes, it's about oil, but it's also about restoring the democracy of the elections of July 2024, in which Edmundo Gonzalez, who by proxy ran when Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Prize winner, was forbidden from being able to run and certainly taken off the ballot. So, as a proxy, Edmundo Gonzalez, who, by the way, is still in exile in Madrid, is that it's really about restoring a government of democracy, of which Venezuela had a long history of before the arrival in 1999 of Hugo Chavez. And so for really 26 years or so, you have seen, and then the succession of Nicolas Maduro in 2013 in the passing away through cancer that Chavez departed the scene, is that Maduro has ruled for the past 12, 13 years in an increasing decline of the economy, freedom of expression, and all of that. It's telling. In 10 years, the GDP of Venezuela has fallen by three quarters. I mean, it is mind numbing that this country that is so resource rich and so prosperous before 1999 is in the abysmal state that it is in today. So back to your question, there are a number of strands to this story in terms of what the objectives are. But in the end, I think it's the restoration of democracy over the longer term. The pathway of that, and I'm sure you're going to get into that in this conversation, is a bit murky because, as we all know, when we have been involved with national security issues, the day after is actually the more complicated piece than the victory sign going up on day one or at 0 day in terms of the activities that we saw. That's not to take anything away from the events of January 3rd, because as we've said, it's a stellar performance and all of that. But I think there's a lot more to this story now that the day after is upon us.
And it should be said that Maduro has been ruling in an autocratic fashion, squelching and arresting and destroying, trying to destroy the opposition in his country and destroying the economy of his country. And so there are no shortage of grievances against Maduro's rule. The president, when he spoke about this, did talk about energy and oil. And I know we want to turn to that. But first, under the rubric of Colin Powell's famous Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you buy it. We've taken out Maduro. Who is running Venezuela today?
I would make the case that Delcy Rodriguez, the presumed sort of follow-on as the vice president, is still running the country. There are three other key players, and now the question becomes, what is their trustworthiness toward one another? But these three players, for your audience, is Minister of Defense Vladimir Padrino, then the head of their national security or Ministry of Interior is Diosdado Cabello, and then Delcy's brother, Jorge Rodriguez, who is the head of the National Assembly. Each and every one of these have been part and parcel of that kind of suppression of liberty and the economic morass and mismanagement of Venezuela going back to the Chavez days. And they are a cabal that are probably still running the country under the scenario of Maduro's in the wake of his departure. And they are a force to be reckoned with because they control the apparatus for security, defense, and the economy from where they sit. And that's really the challenges now of the break it, you own it, Powell refrain that you used in terms of running Venezuela, as the president stated a couple of times, if not more, on Saturday morning at his press conference, is that running Venezuela is going to be the challenge because these additional four individuals, which I categorize as really the cabal that does really govern or run Venezuela today, are very much there in place and control the instruments of Venezuelan national power in terms of a country of 20 million citizens, of which 8 million have departed since the early 2000s into exile. And so you have a country being run still by this cabal.
We're talking to David Shedd, the former acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So, David, you talked about Vice President and acting interim President Rodriguez, Delcy Rodriguez. She said over the weekend that Nicolas Maduro is still the president of Venezuela and that nothing has changed. Has there been regime change in Venezuela? I mean, if Rodriguez is in charge, are we going to be working with Rodriguez as the new leader? Are we going to try to get her out? What is the U.S. policy now towards the Rodriguez government?
Well, I would say that that's the murkiest piece of the U.S. policy now is what is the way forward? She is clearly in charge. Now, I've heard pundits say, well, of course, Delcy Rodriguez had to give that speech because that's the internal audience.
Mm-hmm.
But on the in the channels that undoubtedly are open with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others, she is saying or singing a different tune in terms of cooperation. Now, I know that she's most recently posted messages that she is prepared to work for the peaceful resolution and so forth of this because no one wants war and words to that effect. However, we have to recognize that Delcy Rodriguez, along with her brother and these two other characters that I've mentioned in terms of defense and security, are individuals who are longtime veterans of the oppression that we have seen and all of that, and that they would have no interest and certainly no motivation to now recognize the legitimate electoral results of July 2024, in which the estimate is somewhere between the 70% victory by Edmundo Gonzalez that I mentioned again as a proxy for Maria Corina Machado, and the outcome for Maduro, which then he went on to steal and then inaugurate himself in January of 2024, which is interesting. We're about 1 year into the new 6-year administration. If you were to have a normal place of what Maduro would have been fulfilling at this point in the calendar. And so she will take over. Now the question, and this is what remains murky, is what's the U.S. role in seeing a pathway to the restoration of the legitimacy of the opposition in terms of running Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump sort of poured cold water on the idea that Maria Corina Machado would take over Venezuela. What are you hearing from your sources about Machado, about Edmundo Gonzalez, as you said, now in exile in Spain, efforts by Canada and France and other international players to build support for Machado? What are you hearing about an effort to bring the elected opposition into leadership in Venezuela?
My sources are telling me that they are somewhat confused, and these are senior exiled Venezuelans who would have name recognition to your audience and to you, of course. And they're confused in terms of the way forward. They have not been consulted for the most part, although I do understand that there has been an outreach to Gonzalez for a conversation in Madrid by the administration. And I don't know that to be true of Maria Corina, but we might surmise that there is a conversation about that. I think the confusion and the fog of the day after includes this whole idea: what's the pathway for the restoration of democracy, freedom, liberty, and economic prosperity for Venezuela? And so the argument might be made, and I think the administration is making this argument, that it's through leveraging under real clear parameters and guardrails a transition period that may call for new elections or the restoration of the election results of 2024, using the power brokers that are in Caracas today, because to do otherwise could result in sort of the collapse of the entire system. When you think it's a society now that for some 25, 26 years has relied on paramilitary elements known as colectivos, the security situation, I would say, is on par with the humanitarian crisis in terms of the dire security situation there. And so the argument can be made, Jeremy, that the pathway is to work with the remaining, I call them the cabal, atop of the Venezuelan regime of today, with a pathway forward then for a transition. But so far, the opposition hasn't been included in a material way in those conversations, as far as I know, and that's what they're telling me as well. So I'm basing it on what I'm hearing back from them.
Yeah, I would think, David, and tell me if you agree that before we can really analyze the opportunities for U.S. companies to go in and develop the proven oil reserves in Venezuela, which is, of course, what President Trump said he wanted to be the outcome of this. Before that, there has to be security. And before there can be security, there has to be governance and a political pathway towards stability in the government. I think right now, as you lay out very clearly, there are a lot of questions about who will be in charge of Venezuela. Is that sort of the basic syllogism that you see this through?
Yes, that syllogism applies in spades. The fact is that any foreign direct investment is going to want to address or have addressed those issues that you just laid out. I would go a little bit further, maybe a little deeper. The brain drain cannot be overestimated and overstated in terms of Venezuela. Your engineers and your professional class are a major part of those who have departed Venezuela over the last 20 plus years. And so the restoration not only of security and the rule of law and the judiciary aspects for that are required for investments that will call for billions and billions of dollars to take a very dilapidated PDVSA, the state-owned oil sector and energy sector for Venezuela, and restoring it that it could go back to producing and drawing. The other thing is, you look at the oil markets today, the incentive to go back in at under $60 a barrel would might cause some oil companies, and I'm thinking of the Exxon Mobil's and others such as themselves, and ConocoPhillips and Chevron, to invest more in Venezuela, second thoughts as well. And so I would venture to guess there's very much of a wait and see on the part of the external investors that President Trump talked about, thinking that this would be so attractive in terms of the oil glut, but also domestically, the absence of security and the absence of rule of law is going to be vital to making those decisions.
Given this political uncertainty, it's not like the United States can relax sanctions on Venezuela overnight. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was discussing this in several interviews over this past weekend. And he basically described our policy as not running Venezuela, pivoting a little bit away from where President Trump described the situation. Secretary Rubio said that we're going to keep an oil quarantine on Venezuela. We're going to be able to intercept oil tankers leaving the country using law enforcement and sanctions authorities to do so, and use that mechanism to continue to put pressure on Delcy Rodriguez and the leadership of Venezuela. And so it seems like for the time being, there's going to be there's a long pathway between an oil quarantine or an oil embargo to pressure the current Venezuelan regime to the moment where we can see the relaxation of sanctions, the analysis, the technical analysis of field assessments, surveys, a negotiation of lease agreements, creation of taxation regimes that would allow U.S. companies to operate in Venezuela and help that country rebuild its energy infrastructure. Is that right, David?
That's absolutely correct, but I'll raise you one. I think there's an added dimension that the administration is focused on, and that's Cuba.
Mhm.
So if you cut off the oil supply, as clearly it will be in terms of Venezuelan oil subsidies or gifted oil to Cuba, that will add pressure on the regime there. Now, I am not suggesting that the administration has plans and intentions of doing a similar operation in Cuba because I think they look at it and economically it will fall of its own weight. Now, they have to deal with President Scheinbaum of Mexico, Claudia Scheinbaum. I think it's upwards around 8,000 barrels that are going from Pemex, the parastatal from Mexico to Cuba. But that shutoff of the oil is there. The other one is a message to China. The oil, the petroleum taken out of, as I said, somewhere in the 700 to 800,000 barrels a day, about half to three quarters of that goes to China. It's a heavy crude that requires very unique refining, and China has been doing that. So that cutoff has a sort of knock on or knock off effect on Cuba, on China, as well as, of course, the issue on the indictments and the kinds of sanctions that are in place. I don't see any of those being lifted until there's a trajectory toward the government change and the regime being moving on into democratic mode. How they get there, as I've already said, is an area where we can have different views on that pathway.
And just to put a bow on this, David, so again, Venezuela is believed to have about 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. It pumps only about 850,000 barrels a day,
Correct.
which really is less than 1%, I think, of the global oil market. So, it's not like there's going to be a big impact to global oil markets overnight. The price of crude, as you referenced, is below $60. So there may be a disincentive for U.S. majors to go in there, certainly with the security and political situation uncertain. This is going to take billions and tens of billions of dollars of investment, and we might not see the proceeds of this until 2030, 2031, or beyond. So this is going to require years-long focus on Venezuela. I mean, one thing that's kind of become so clear over the last several days is that the U.S. is going to have to play a major long-term role in Venezuela, whether we like it or not, whether we think the policy was wise or not to take out Maduro. This is going to herald a major new era of intervention and engagement between the U.S. and Venezuela.
No question about that. But here's the good news, or maybe it's the glass half full. You have Venezuelans, and I know them quite well, who are anxious both to return to Venezuela, and you have Venezuelans who are anxious to lead their own country. The receptivity is overwhelming, as many of the listeners of this can attest in seeing Doral, the epicenter of Venezuelan exiles, just a few miles from where I live in North Miami, that they will step up to this in a way that is very positive, in my view. There's talent, there's an educated class that's prepared to return. I'm not minimizing the challenges by any means. I'm not suggesting this will be an easy or short-term fix to the problem, but we use that old expression, the old adage, it's the people stupid. We
Mhm.
have capabilities in the Venezuelan people to lead their country out of this in ways that is very promising to me. And I think will we have to be engaged? Of course we will. I think the security apparatus alone will require U.S. assistance. I was trying to think of an analogy to what we would be doing, and I think back to the early 2000s, 2002, 3, when I was in the White House in the NSC staff, of the creation of the Plan Colombia. And
Mhm.
Plan Colombia, which ran through about 2016, when the FARC, the insurgency, the largest insurgency of Colombia, came in, and there was the amnesty and all the rest that came with it, but a real opportunity to build upon Venezuela, which, because of what we've been talking about, in the long term would be very well resourced by Venezuela and by Venezuelans.
Mhm.
Therein lies the answer. It is not about us running and putting in, a U.S. leadership in Caracas to do this. There are Venezuelans ready to do this.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with more of our discussion with David Shedd.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Well, you mentioned, David, some of the other countries in the region. I want to quickly go through those. President Trump has said should serve as a warning to Cuba, even to Colombia, where leaders there are under sanction. He's even talked about Greenland, and I think really laid out or tried to sketch out a modern version of the Monroe Doctrine, talking about the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of U.S. dominance of the Western Hemisphere, promotion of democracy. Do you think that the United States will get involved militarily in some of those places I've referenced, in Cuba, in Colombia, in Greenland?
I doubt it will do so militarily, but as we've seen in the case of Panama and the Panama Canal and the two ends of the canal where the Chinese presence is in terms of the port services is something that kind of was the opening salvo, if we all look back about a year ago, in terms of the Trump administration talking about Panama, is that I think we're going to see far more pressure on the governments of Latin America, Central and South America, to really align themselves to the U.S. policy objectives in the region, which would include, of course, if not cutting out, certainly curtailing the influence of China. And we're seeing that effort underway with Javier Milei in Argentina. You've seen now the rise of a center-right government in Chile. You have Noboa in Ecuador. You have Peru. You have Paraguay. My prediction is that next year's October elections in Brazil will not go Lula's way. I think it will go back to center right, not a Bolsonaro win, but certainly a center right, pro private sector government emerging from that election. And so you have, and Petro in Colombia that you mentioned, of course, is in deep political, deep waters in terms of his popularity with May elections of this year now that are and I fully suspect that the center right will again emerge from in an Uribe-like style in Colombia. So I think that the winds are certainly going in that direction that I think would curtail the inclination to intervene militarily in any of these other places. And I think in the case of Cuba, as I said previously, I think it will be the downfall of a regime of its own weight when it happens, as opposed to military intervention.
Yeah, and David, I think one of the things we love about you is your humility, and I think that's born of your experience as as an operations officer and as an analyst. It's very difficult to predict. I think if anyone would have looked back at the last year and said, would the Trump administration conduct an airstrike with 7 B-2s against Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo in Iran, few of us would have predicted exactly how large that operation would have been. And I think if any one of us would have predicted even weeks ago that Delta Force would sweep into Caracas and arrest Maduro, I think some of us would have said probably not. Maybe land strikes, maybe covert operations against some ports, certainly an escalation of the boat strikes. So in both of those cases, Iran and Venezuela, I feel like the president chose the big option, the kind of the of all the courses of action presented to him. And so I think sitting here today, you probably would agree it's very difficult to predict where this administration could go next, particularly with respect to Cuba and Colombia, where the president's already making noise. There's the old adage: if someone tells you who they are, believe them. And so I think it's a buckle your chin strap moment for the hemisphere and for the world. I want to turn, David, just quickly just to the issue of narcotics and then come back to the larger geopolitical dynamics. Most of the fentanyl coming into the United States that has poisoned, sickened, and even killed tens of thousands of Americans have come from Chinese precursors assembled in factories in Mexico, run by the Sinaloa and Jalisco Boys cartel, CJNG cartel, into the United States. Fentanyl does not principally come from Venezuela. Venezuela is a cocaine exporter primarily to Europe and other markets. Is there a narcotics rationale for this operation that you can discern? And what do you think about the next steps with respect to Mexico and what Scheinbaum has said and the implications for U.S.-Mexico relations?
There is a proper predicate given on the 2020 indictment against Maduro pertaining to the drug trafficking charges. So I think you have a legal pylon much akin to 1989 with Noriega in Panama that will make it never say an airtight case entirely, but in terms of the prosecution now of Maduro on the basis of drug charges. That said, when you unpack it and peel back the layers associated with the overall drug trafficking and production, and then the delivery of that into the United States, you're absolutely correct in your characterization of where the fundamental area and challenge exists for the United States when it comes to the supply side. And the demand conversation is a whole different conversation in terms of that. But on the supply side, it's Mexico, and it is these cartels. And I would argue that, from my knowledge, these cartels had the reach even into Venezuela, as they do into Colombia and Ecuador, in other places in the region, Bolivia and so forth in Peru, where these cartels are so powerful and so vertically integrated that they have capabilities for really their activities, and the center of that is Mexico. And you've mentioned a couple of the cartels. I count about 10 to 12 of those cartels of lesser renown, but the Golfo cartel and others that are all part of the fentanyl trafficking, and that really was not coming out of Venezuela by and large. And in the case of cocaine, that cocaine was transiting from Colombia through Venezuela, enabled by the other sort of counter or insurgency group, ELN, the National Liberation Army from Colombia through Venezuela to West Africa and then on up to Europe. So it wasn't even transiting primarily for the United States. It doesn't mean there wasn't any, but that wasn't the natural flow of the cocaine trade. But your fentanyl and other aspects of it, and the precursors, as you note, having a China origin, are really into Mexico and then on up to the United States. And so,
yeah. I mean, I know I mentioned this, David, and I think you're pointing this out as well, which is that, again, if the administration's central premise for this operation in Caracas is to deal with the drug problem, then there's going to be, I think, an increasing focus on Mexico, because that is where the drug problem principally emanates from. And Mexico is obviously critically important to the United States. We share this massive 2,000-mile land border with Mexico. Our economies are incredibly interdependent. I mean, people think of a border as a hermetically sealed wall. It's not. There are thousands of people and trucks and movement of goods that cross between the United States and Mexico, many cars, that are part of the American car industry are actually manufactured, partially built in Mexico. We have enormous trade. There are implications for USMCA, which President Trump has talked about, changing or maybe even pulling out of. If we're going to get really serious about the stopping the drug flow with Mexico, it could have enormous economic implications for a number of industries in the United States. And I just think it's really critical that companies and folks that are advising these companies keep their eye on this.
No question about that, because when I look at Mexico, where I served for 5 years,
Hmm.
I can tell you that, and I was there at the establishment of NAFTA, which is the predecessor to USMCA, as the trilateral trade deal with Canada and, of course, the United States that Mexico has only led to greater integration of our economies in terms of the supply chain and all of that. And as we look at, and my book points out, in the Great Heist, is this dependency on the Chinese portion of the supply chain is something that we want to see reversed in terms of bringing it into the hemisphere in that regard. So the issue of security for Mexico is a fascinating one, and one that I'm watching very carefully, because I think Scheinbaum, unlike his predecessor, Lopez Obrador, affectionately known as AMLO, for his 6 years, kind of embraced the not the narco trafficking itself, but that the way to deal with it was to integrate them into society. That did not work out well. There are still somewhere between 30 to 40,000 deaths caused by violent deaths related to the cartels in Mexico, and so there's swaths of Mexico that are ungoverned. So now Scheinbaum has an opportunity, and I think she is trying to make the best of that opportunity to, in part, maybe perversely, but very real to her, prevent the U.S. from doing kinetic operations, and by that I mean Hellfire missiles and that sort of thing on targets inside Mexico. Here's the problem for her, and I sense this from the Mexicans that I speak to, is that the administration always appears to have a moving target. It's not clear what good is good enough. And again, I'm not defending the fact that these cartels still operate. Everything we've just said about the cartels and their ability to move their illicit drugs across the border by all kinds of means. Even though there's been a border closure in terms of the immigration aspect of it, there really hasn't been a significant downturn that I know of pertaining to the illicit drug flow from Mexico, despite enormous cooperation with the United States on security, which I can't go into in any detail, but the security is in terms of cooperation at an all-time high under Scheinbaum. The problem is that when you try to define what's good enough, I don't know what that is, and I'm sure that she struggles with knowing what good enough is, while still having to rule a very 130 million people country that is very proud and clearly has we have a history with Mexico, as you well know, that she needs to protect in terms of the nationalistic view of
Yep.
letting them do what they need to do.
David, let me get quickly before we get to wrap up on a couple of more items. We've gotten some questions from listeners. Russia and China. What lessons quickly will Putin and Xi Jinping learn from this? I mean, some analysis has said, well, Putin might feel emboldened to take more aggressive action against Zelensky in Ukraine. China might feel more emboldened to take action against Taiwan. Will they be in any way deterred by this action in Venezuela? Will they be emboldened? What's your kind of quick take on that?
Quickly, I think that the first takeaway will be that we're moving into much more of a spheres of influence construct. And I would say you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, and some have tongue-in-cheek called it the Doctrine of moving into the hemisphere in terms of supporting our national interests, in terms of our interests. And Venezuela would clearly fall into that category, that would signal to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, respectively, on Russia, Ukraine, and Taiwan, that in fact the willingness of the United States to sort of see an end state in either place is diminished because of this operation, but the message that the operation sends. On the other hand, of course, it would send a message that the president is decisive when he needs to be, but it always has to be in the self-interest of the United States. And you see this playing out even in the Zelensky negotiations with Russia and the U.S. on everything east of the Dnieper River in Donbass, be it there or even in the messaging with Taiwan and Xi. So what I'm watching very carefully, and I encourage your audience and yourself to watch very carefully, is both the preparation and then the outtake of President Trump's planned visit to Beijing this spring. What is sort of the intended outcome on that, where we have a Xi Jinping making it very clear that 2027 is sort of his timeline for Taiwan in terms of the buildup that they see, and is that going to be a full out invasion, or is it a stranglehold economically, or both, that sort of thing. And so they look at events like this. Now, the other thing that I would suggest is that probably they're getting a message that if Cuba starts to fall, stay out of it. And that's particularly to the Russians, but also the Chinese have a large listening base there that has been publicly acknowledged in terms of presence there. And so, it might be that it's messaging this is in our near abroad, stay out of it. And that, of course, has the other side of the coin. Their near abroads, respectively, again, or something that they may take away as a message that we won't be there when we said we would be, in the case of Taiwan, or in the case of the ultimate direction of whatever a peace settlement looks like in Ukraine, that we won't be there to see it. And we've seen this in the messaging to the Europeans, that this is really your problem.
Yep. David, I want to conclude with kind of the big question about regime change and about U.S. interests. I want to quote from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who, of course, served in the United States Senate, where later this week a privilege resolution will be brought to the floor under the War Powers Act that directs the president to remove U.S. forces from hostilities within or against Venezuela that have not been authorized by Congress. This is going to be sort of a test vote this week in the Congress, where there's been a lot of concerns raised about the failure to brief Congress, the failure to discuss the operation in advance with congressional leadership and the Gang of Eight, and where senators will have to go on record talking about how to use military force against Venezuela. Secretary Rubio said this weekend on Face the Nation, quote, "I still think that a lot of people analyze everything that happens in foreign policy through the lens of what happened from 2001 through, 2015 or 2016. The whole, foreign policy apparatus thinks everything is Libya, everything is Iraq, everything is Afghanistan. This is not the Middle East. And our mission here is very different. This is the Western Hemisphere. Within the Western Hemisphere, we have a country, potentially a very rich country, that has cozied itself up under the control of this regime, has cozied up to Iran, has cozied up to Hezbollah, has cozied to narco-trafficking gangs to operate with impunity from their own territory. It allows boats with drugs to traffic from their territory, and we are addressing that." And so Secretary of State Rubio is sort of, I think, sounds like diverging a little bit from the MAGA principle of no foreign intervention, no regime change, which of course President Trump campaigned on very aggressively, and said, but this is different. This is the Western Hemisphere. And then I also want to read a quick quote from Jack Reed, the senator from Rhode Island, a West Point graduate who serves as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, who I think we would all agree is a serious national security thinker. And he said of the Venezuela operation, quote, "No serious plan has been presented for how such an extraordinary undertaking would work or what it will cost the American people. History offers no shortage of warnings about the costs, human, strategic, and moral, of assuming we can govern another nation by force. David, I want to give you the last word on this big question about regime change and the ability, the capability of the United States to run Venezuela for the short, medium, and long term.
Well, as we've already heard Secretary Rubio sort of readjust, if I want to be careful there in terms of what the president really meant to say about run Venezuela. The question, and I come back to the talent, the ability of the Venezuelans to really chart their own future and working with them to do so. I'm a huge believer that that is really the way forward. The other thing that I think would be a terrible mistake is undertake something akin to the de-Baathification that took place in the late 2003-2004 period in Iraq, and that gave rise to the Sons of Iraq. And Anbar, as you and I both know, Jeremy, was a terrible period and at risk in terms of what we had gone into Iraq in March of 2003 to do. So Rubio is absolutely right to say Venezuela is not Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan in that regard. In terms of this sphere of influence, I cannot underscore enough that I think that that's what we're seeing, what will, I think, historically become known as the Trump doctrine, which is in your near abroad, you take care of what you need for your national security. We can quibble over whether that's worth it or the means for doing it. And of course, the military often talks about means and ends. The end is you have a more stable Venezuela, ideally coming out of this in terms of the regime change. And one could argue that the basis for that, and I'm not sure why the administration hasn't used this with a clear, resounding message to the country, that this is really the outcome of the July 2024 elections in Venezuela. The people did speak, and that this would be the way to characterize this, and that then, this truly was a law enforcement operation. So in the end, I think that, regime change in Venezuela is probably the first and only one that they will do in the hemisphere, but the message has been sent loud and clear to those who would challenge that this president's not shy about using force if that's what's required.
Beacon Global Strategies is, of course, advising our clients, U.S. companies from key allies and partners that are concerned about and watching and interested in these developments, whether they are defense or technology companies that are providing capabilities to the U.S. government in this new era of geopolitical competition, or focus on our near abroad, as David laid out, or whether there are companies that are interested in understanding sanctions and economic policies and the changing nature of our policy towards Venezuela or other countries in our hemisphere. We are so grateful to our senior advisors like David Shedd, a former acting director of the DIA and the author of The Great Heist, China's epic campaign to steal America's secrets, and truly one of our country's foremost experts on the Western Hemisphere, on Latin America. David, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That was David Shedd. I'm Jeremy Bash. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in becoming a sponsor of our program, please email our team at bgsd.com. You can also find that email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.